Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jose Guzman, and today I'll be talking to you about rock formations and the three different types of rocks that can be found anywhere on the planet. Now, this is not to be confused with Dwayne Johnson, aka The Rock. No, I'm referring to actual rocks. So, quick overview: the landforms is a characteristic shape of the land's surface. The landform is always changing. Okay, is that it? No, there is more. How are landforms formed, and how did they make it into this list? Now, landforms are, as I mentioned, are constantly changing due to the heat contained in the Earth's core that influences movement at the Earth's surface. Now, the lithosphere is driven by continual transfers of energy and heat as it interacts with the three different types of spheres. Now, the two processes involved, as I mentioned, is endogenic, which is internal, and exogenic, which is external processes. Now, during an endogenic process, it is basically forces that cause movement beneath or on the Earth's surface. Now, this is what's going to contribute to your mountain building, your formations of volcanoes, earthquakes, etc. Now, simultaneously, it's another process that's occurring, which is called the exogenic process. These are the forces of erosion, such as running water, wind, and chemical action. Now, when I say chemical actions, I'm referring to not nuclear war, but basically actual chemical actions, natural, such as when iron comes into contact with oxygen, it oxidizes, which forms rust. Thus, the rust becomes to flake off, etc. Another example would probably be limestone. Limestone is heavily composed of calcium. Now, when calcium comes into contact with water, it strips the calcium away from the rock, which will contribute to your sinkholes, as I'll mention later on in the PowerPoint. Now, endogenic processes forms the rock, and once the rocks are formed and exposed, exogenic kicks in, erodes the material, moving them from high elevations, such as mountains and stuff like that, and moves them down slopes and deposits them to lakes, oceans, and other low-lying areas. Now, as I mentioned earlier with how the two coexist, shield volcanoes, as I'll mention later on, are volcanoes. They erupt relatively fluid lava, and as the lava comes in contact with the Earth's surface and the oxygen, it cools and quickly solidifies. An example of this would be the rock known as basalt, and no, not the drug they saw in Miami. So, how are rocks formed? So, as Earth's crust moves, its materials are eroded, deposited, and heated and cooled, and then eventually buried and exposed. Now, as I mentioned before, or eroded and deposited, this is what's going to cause probably your sedimentary rocks. You're also going to bring rocks from high elevations down to low elevations into lakes and stuff like that. Heated and cool would probably be the best example of either igneous rocks, and buried and exposed, I will probably closely relate it to metamorphic rocks. So, types of rocks, as I literally just mentioned it, you have igneous rocks, sedimentary rocks, and metamorphic rocks. Igneous rocks. Okay, so igneous rocks are formed of molten crustal materials, cools and solidifies, as I mentioned with the shield volcano, and it creates rocks such as basalt or granite. A fun fact to help you guys remember: igneous comes from the Greek word fire, which is the same as the root word for the English language of ignite, hence your name, the igneous rocks. Next on the list is sedimentary rocks. So sedimentary rocks are the results when rocks erode from high elevations, as I mentioned, mountains, valleys, hills, plains, etc., and they accumulate at lower level elevations, such as swamps or ocean bottoms. Now, during this accumulation, as they're coming from the high elevation so low, it builds up great pressure, and along with it, other minerals and materials that's going to help bind it together. Best way that I learned in high school to remember this is a rock called the conglomerate. So most people are really into hip hop and rap. They know that a lot of rappers back in the day used to refer to the posses, their group, as the conglomerate. It's close together. Another example would be limestone, as I mentioned earlier in our PowerPoint. Limestone is basically just a whole bunch of minerals compiled into one, calcium and other stuff like that. Next on the list is metamorphic rock. So metamorphic rocks are created when rocks are exposed to great pressure and heat, which is basically altering them and making them more compact and crystalline rocks. A perfect example, for some strange reason, is one of my favorite, is the shale. So shale with great pressure and heat becomes slate. The way I remember this was in high school. If you ever got in trouble, you say, holy shale. Getting a lot of trouble, a lot of pressure. Eventually, with enough heat, you get a clean slate. Fun fact is that the word metamorphic comes from the Greek word which means to change forms. And a fun way to remember that is if you guys ever watch Power Rangers, they morph, change form, into their costumes. And ladies and gentlemen, that is a quick overview of rocks formations and the different types of rocks. Now for your homework assignment, I would like you to choose 2 additional rocks that haven't been mentioned in the PowerPoint and name 2 rocks for each category. So as before I mentioned conglomerate, that's a sedimentary rock. I would like to mention 2 additional rocks into that. Second one, I would like you to use a diagram, and that could be found in the textbook, and of the rock cycle. And then just briefly list all the steps that are involved in formations of each rock type. So like igneous rock, how is that formed, metamorphic rocks, heat and pressure, stuff like that. And then lastly, apply the rock cycle to a rock of your choosing. I enjoy learning about the shale, and with enough heat and pressure it turns into a slate rock. Another one would be limestone. So limestone, once it undergoes the metamorphic process and then enjoys a lot of heat and pressure, it actually turns into marble. So just choose a random rock and just apply that to your cycle. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.